saw what others couldn't. Long before the world began to fracture under the weight of confusion and chaos, Padre Pio spoke of things to come, events so extraordinary, so catastrophic, that many dismissed them as legends. But now, as global unrest deepens and spiritual darkness seems to spread, his words are no longer just mystical echoes from the past. They are beginning to feel disturbingly real. And among his most chilling revelations is one prophecy that some believe may be unfolding right now. To understand the weight of these warnings, we must first understand the man who gave them. Born in a small farming village in southern Italy in 1887, Francesco Forgiani was not the kind of child anyone expected would one day shake the foundations of the modern church. His family was poor, living a simple life. But even as a boy, Francesco displayed a depth of spiritual awareness that set him apart. He spoke openly of visions of Jesus and Mary, and of fierce battles with demonic forces, all before he had even reached his teenage years. He prayed constantly, fasted often, and carried a silent burden in his heart that few could comprehend. At 15, he entered the Capuchin order, taking the name Pio. Life in the monastery was austere: early mornings, harsh winters, and long hours of silence and prayer. But Padre Pio embraced it without hesitation. Though frail in body, he possessed an iron-like will and an unshakable devotion to Christ. What others saw as suffering, he saw as a gift. And soon, the world would come to know him not just as a priest, but as a man touched by the supernatural. It was a still and solemn night in the quiet monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo. Most of the friars had already retreated to their rooms, their prayers completed, their lamps extinguished. The stone walls held a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional creak of ancient wood or the distant whisper of wind. But in one small candlelit cell, something far beyond the natural world was beginning to unfold. Padre Pio, aged, weary, and fully aware that his time on earth was drawing to a close, had entered into deep, urgent prayer. It was a kind of prayer that transcended routine, a soul-to-soul cry from man to God. The candle before him flickered gently, casting shadows across the room, and then, without warning, that flickering light was consumed by a brilliance unlike anything of this world. This was not fire. It was not dawn. It was something altogether otherworldly, a divine radiance that seemed to collapse time, to bend the very fabric of reality. Padre Pio could not move. His hands began to tremble, his heart thundered in his chest, and then the vision began. What he saw next tore at the very center of his soul. He did not dream. He did not imagine. He was shown. He later described being taken beyond the boundaries of space and time, into a spiritual dimension where the veil between heaven and earth no longer held. There, in that timeless place, Padre Pio witnessed a world unraveling. Cities crumbled under waves of fire, their skylines swallowed by thick black smoke. The air was poisoned. People ran through streets in panic, searching for safety that could not be found. Oceans surged violently, rising and sweeping over entire coastlines. Even the mountains, those ancient, immovable guardians of the earth, collapsed as though they had never existed. And this, he knew, was only the beginning. But the devastation Padre Pio witnessed was not limited to nature. What tore at him most was what he saw beneath the surface, a collapse not of buildings, but of souls. Humanity, he realized, was drifting away from its creator. The bond between heaven and earth was unraveling, not with fire and thunder, but through something quieter, colder. Hearts had grown numb. Faith was crumbling. In his vision, once revered churches stood empty, hollow echoes of sacred places where prayer had once lifted like incense toward heaven. Now they were abandoned, their sanctuaries filled only with silence. Priests and ministers were no longer shepherds, but targets. Ridiculed, rejected, driven into hiding. And above all, a thick wave of spiritual deception had begun to suffocate the world. It was subtle, clever, and devastating. Even those who had once stood firm in their beliefs were now faltering, confused, disoriented, unsure of what was true and what was counterfeit. Then Padre Pio saw something that shattered his heart. Dark shadow, like figures moved among the people, not physical creatures, but spiritual entities cloaked in silence. They whispered into the minds of the innocent, sowing doubt like seeds into once fertile ground. Despair took root where faith had once flourished. Some souls, blessed with spiritual sight, screamed in terror, recognizing the evil in their midst. But most saw nothing. They continued with their lives, oblivious to the darkness they had unknowingly welcomed. He watched with anguish as people willingly opened their hearts to illusion, drawn in by empty promises, led quietly by forces they could not see. Whole communities fell under the spell. The deception was so complete, so convincing, that the divine became forgotten, and truth was twisted beyond recognition. That night, back in the monastery, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It echoed down the stone corridors, waking the friars from their sleep. They rushed toward the sound, hearts racing. When they reached Padre Pio's cell, they found him collapsed on the floor, pale, trembling, his face streaked with something unmistakable, blood. He could not speak. His hands quivered, and his eyes, usually filled with warmth, now held a sorrow that words could never carry. But Padre Pio said nothing. Not that night, nor the next. For 7 full days, he remained in total silence, unable to speak, unable to share the weight of what had been revealed to him. His fellow friars watched helplessly, praying beside him, uncertain if he would ever recover. Whatever he had seen, it had left him shattered in both body and spirit. At last, on the 7th day, he spoke. His voice was faint, little more than a whisper. But the words he uttered would never be forgotten by those who heard them. The world will be tested in ways never seen before. What I have witnessed has shattered my soul. But God has a plan. Only those who remain firm in faith will endure. After that, Padre Pio withdrew even deeper into his life of prayer. The serenity he once carried was replaced by a growing urgency. He pleaded with those around him to return to the sacraments, to confess regularly, to pray without ceasing, to cling to their faith like a lifeline. He warned them, not with fear, but with love. A defining moment was approaching, a spiritual divide, a separation between those who were awake and those who chose to remain blind. But what haunted him most wasn't the terror of the vision itself. It was how few were listening. Life continued. The world moved forward. People carried on with their routines, unmoved by the subtle yet growing signs that something was changing. And yet, those signs were there for anyone willing to see, warnings not hidden, but clear like writing on the wall. Still, many brushed them off, waiting for the final moment, a moment that, for many, would come too late. In the final days of his life, Padre Pio confided in his closest spiritual companions. With tears in his eyes, he spoke of a coming darkness, not just literal, but spiritual, a time of testing that would stretch humanity's faith to its breaking point. He warned them that only those anchored in grace, those whose faith remained unshaken, would endure without falling into fear or deception. This vision was never meant to remain locked away in a forgotten journal or bound to the century in which he lived. It was not a message for a single moment. It was a prophecy meant for our generation, for our time. And while the world continues to spin in distraction, those with open eyes and discerning hearts can already feel the tremble of what's coming. The question isn't whether the warning is real. The question is, are we ready? The vision that left Padre Pio in 7 days of stunned silence, marked with tears of blood, was not a metaphor. It was precise. It was personal. And according to those who were closest to him, it pointed directly to the years 2024 and 2025. But before the true darkness arrives, Padre Pio said heaven would give us signs, unmistakable signals, meant to awaken the soul. These signs would begin subtly, like distant thunder on the horizon. In 2024, they would whisper. In 2025, they would roar. They wouldn't be random. They wouldn't be coincidences. They would be spiritual alarms ringing through a world that had forgotten how to listen. And though many would dismiss them as natural phenomena or strange anomalies, those who remain spiritually awake would know exactly what they are. It would begin with the earth itself. Padre Pio foresaw the exact fulfillment of his vision through a wave of natural disasters, not isolated events, but a global shaking unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. He spoke of earthquakes erupting in places long thought immune, fault lines trembling beneath cities that had stood undisturbed for centuries. Towering skyscrapers would sway like trees in the wind. Entire skylines would tremble. Storms, sudden and violent, would strike out of season, ripping through coastal towns, flooding inland cities, moving against the rhythm of nature. Hurricanes would swell with unprecedented force. Wildfires would ignite with little warning. And then, the skies themselves would turn against us. Solar storms, once rare, barely understood, would begin to grow in power and frequency. They would tear through the Earth's magnetic field, disrupting satellites, communication networks, and entire power grids. Planes grounded, phones silenced, and all of it would spread a ripple of panic faster than the disasters themselves. To the untrained eye, it would look like nature rebelling, the Earth lashing out against man. But Padre Pio understood something deeper. These were not accidents. They were signs, heaven's alarms, warnings meant to shake the soul before the veil between light and shadow grows too thin to see. But just as he had feared, most would ignore them, choosing logic over faith, explanation over reflection, until the final moment arrived. And it was too late. And then came something stranger still. Padre Pio described a distortion, not just of weather patterns, but of creation itself. The very rhythm of the earth, he said, would fall out of step. Seasons would lose their order. He saw flowers blooming in the heart of winter, delicate petals unfolding beneath blankets of snow. Summer fields, meant to bask in golden light, would instead vanish under thick layers of frost. Rain would fall when skies should be clear. Snow would strike when the heat was unbearable. To scientists, it would be baffling. To governments, deeply troubling. But to the faithful, it would be confirmation. A reflection not just of environmental disorder, but of a far more dangerous collapse. The soul of humanity out of sync with God. Nature, Padre Pio said, would become a mirror, showing us, in unmistakable ways, that something at the core of the world had gone wrong. The earth groaning under the weight of our disobedience. And still, the vision continued. He saw a collapse of a different kind, one not of landscape, but of structure. A crumbling of the very systems humanity depends on. Banks, governments, currencies. Institutions once believed unshakable would begin to unravel overnight. Economies would be shaken to their roots. Banks would close without warning. People would wake to find their money worthless. The foundations upon which entire lives had been built, jobs, savings, pensions, security, would collapse in a moment. Panic would spread. Trust would vanish. And nations would scramble, desperate to contain the fallout. As the chaos deepened, world leaders would respond in the only way they knew how. Emergency measures would be announced. Press conferences would fill the airwaves with calls for unity, stability, and trust. New policies would be introduced, swift, sweeping and packaged in promises of order. And then, at the peak of desperation, a new system would quietly emerge. To the frightened and weary, it would appear as an answer, a necessary step. It would offer relief, access to food, to financial aid, to social safety nets. It would be described not as control, but as protection. Not as limitation, but as progress. And many would embrace it without hesitation, relieved to feel a sense of structure returning. But Padre Pio saw what others could not. He warned that beneath the reassuring surface of this new system lay something far more dangerous, a spiritual compromise so subtle that it would go unnoticed by most. It would not force submission. It wouldn't demand rebellion. Instead, it would slowly shape lives from the inside out. Choices would begin to shift. Freedoms would quietly narrow. And those who had accepted the system without prayer or discernment would find themselves further from God, not through open rebellion, but through gradual transformation. What began as convenience would become quiet control. And while the world celebrated the return of order, the spiritually awake would understand the truth. This was not just a political change. It was a test of faith, one disguised as progress. Only those rooted in prayer, guided by grace, would see it for what it truly was. But the most disturbing part of the vision was still to come. Padre Pio saw a deception so vast, so cunning, that it would reach into every home, through the screens that people trusted most. Phones, televisions, computers. The battleground would not be a battlefield, but a living room. This deception would not come by force, but through images, sounds, carefully crafted spectacles. Apparent signs and wonders would be broadcast across the world, so realistic, so emotionally charged, that even sincere believers would find themselves questioning what was real. Digital illusions would move hearts and stir emotions, shaping what people felt, believed, and obeyed. Events that seemed miraculous would be nothing more than manufactured phenomena, choreographed to look divine, but rooted in deception. The real battle, Padre Pio warned, would not be fought with weapons. It would be fought with perception. It would be a war for the soul, waged in silence, through screens and symbols, through whispers and compromises. And in that moment, the test would not be what people saw, but what they chose to believe. Lies would wear the appearance of light. Truth would be buried beneath layers of distraction, and most would never know it happened. Technology, once hailed as the pinnacle of human achievement, would become the very tool of spiritual disorientation, reshaping hearts, bending minds, and quietly rewriting the boundaries of what people believed was real. Padre Pio saw that those lacking spiritual discernment would fall easily under its spell. They would believe what they saw without question, without prayer, without pause, not realizing that their trust had been captured by something that no longer served truth. And then came the most sobering part of the prophecy. He foresaw a moment approaching, a spiritual crossroads, a dividing line unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. He called it the Great Separation, and it would begin in the year 2025. It would be a time when every soul on earth would be brought face to face with a choice, not forced, but inevitable. A choice to stand in the light of truth, or to follow the growing shadow of global deception. There would be no middle ground, no more hesitation, no more hiding. The separation would be absolute, not in politics or ideology, but in spirit. Every heart would be revealed for what it truly believed. There would be no middle path, no room for hesitation, no place to hide. Padre Pio warned that the time was coming when neutrality would no longer be an option. Each heart would be revealed, not simply by spoken words, but by silence, by action, or by inaction. What a person truly believed would no longer be hidden behind tradition or appearances. Through every quiet choice or public stance, the soul's allegiance would be made known. But this, he said, was not punishment. It was mercy, a final opportunity, a divine test permitted by heaven, not to condemn, but to expose, to illuminate the truth of each soul. Those who had built their lives on a foundation of prayer, who had remained rooted in faith, would stand firm. They would recognize the moment. They would not be shaken. But others, those who had allowed themselves to drift, lulled by the comforts of the world and distracted by its noise, would be caught off guard. And by the time they realized they were in danger, the wave of deception would have already swept them away. Padre Pio was clear. What the world would witness in the years 2024 and 2025 would not be the final chapter, but the beginning of something greater, a season of reckoning, a global purification that would prepare the earth and the soul for what was yet to come. It would be a time of choice, of sifting, of separation, and the only question that remained was whether we would be ready. Then came the vision that would haunt Padre Pio's final days. On a quiet night, beneath the faint flicker of candlelight in his monastic cell, he received a revelation that shook him to the core. What he saw was not symbolic or vague. It was piercing, overwhelming, and terrifying in its clarity. He saw a time when a complete and unnatural darkness would fall upon the world. A darkness not brought by nightfall or eclipse, but by divine command. He saw the sun and the moon vanish from the sky, leaving the earth in a silence so profound it would feel as though time itself had paused. This was what he called the 3 days of darkness, a period unlike anything the world had ever seen. During those 3 days, he said, the planet would be covered in a suffocating gloom. Cities would go silent. Streets would empty. Doors would be bolted. Windows sealed. The air would feel heavy, thick with dread and confusion. But this darkness, Padre Pio explained, would not be merely physical. It would be deeply spiritual, a darkness that pressed down upon the soul, exposing every weakness, every fear, every hidden part of the heart. And it would test humanity in ways no one was prepared for. According to Padre Pio's vision, the darkness that would fall over the earth would not be empty. It would be inhabited. During those 3 dreadful nights, malevolent spiritual entities would be permitted to roam freely across the world. These beings would not remain hidden. They would take on visible forms, some familiar, others foreign, some appearing even as loved ones, and they would speak with voices crafted to deceive. He saw them standing outside locked doors, mimicking the cries of children, the voices of spouses, the pleas of family members. They would call to people by name, beg to be let in, and those ruled by fear or lured by curiosity would open their doors, and they would not survive. Many who heard this vision asked, how could anyone endure such a time? Padre Pio's answer was solemn and clear. Stay inside. Lock your doors. Open them for no one, no matter what you hear. He warned that even the most familiar voice could be used as a mask by the forces of darkness. The only protection would come not from strength, but from unwavering faith and constant prayer. He revealed that all artificial light would fail. Electricity would vanish. Communication would cease. Phones, satellites, the entire digital world would fall silent. The only light that would shine through the darkness would come from blessed candles, consecrated and kept for this very moment. And just before the darkness descended, there would be a final sign, a thunderous sound from the heavens, shaking the earth to its core. Then the skies would blacken, and the 3 days would begin. What followed would be chaos. Screams in the distance. People running through the streets, searching for answers that could no longer be found. But even in the midst of terror, there would still be hope. Padre Pio saw that those who clung to their faith, who prayed the rosary, who trusted completely in God's protection, they would be shielded. The darkness would not touch them. They would remain invisible to the forces that prowled outside. And after 3 long nights, a light brighter than any dawn would pierce the shadows. It would bathe the world in warmth and clarity once again. But Padre Pio warned, the world would not return to what it was before. Nothing would ever be the same again. This prophecy is not a myth, not a tale meant to frighten. It is a message, a divine warning sent from above, a final call to a world drifting into spiritual sleep. What Padre Pio saw was not the end of the world, but a purification, a time of decision, a moment when each soul would have to choose between fear and faith, between deception and truth. God has never left his people without signs. From the beginning of time, he has spoken through prophets, through visions, through the still voice that whispers in prayer. And for those who are willing to listen, the signs are already here. The skies are shifting. The seasons are out of rhythm. The hearts of men are growing cold. And yet, even now, grace is being poured out for those who are willing to return to the light. So we must ask ourselves a question, the same one that echoed from Padre Pio's trembling voice across time. Are we truly ready? For within the depths of his vision, one final and defining truth stood out. Humanity would be divided. On one side, those overwhelmed by fear, drawn to the soothing voices of false leaders. These leaders would offer peace, security, and stability, but all of it built on illusion. And many would follow, not knowing the cost. The other side, those who looked beyond appearances, souls sharpened by prayer, rooted in faith. These individuals would see the signs for what they truly were, not causes for panic, but divine signals to prepare. Padre Pio warned that many would choose to ignore it all. They would carry on as if nothing had changed, chasing comfort, clinging to material pleasures, turning away from every message that heaven had mercifully placed before them. But those grounded in God, those who truly sought him with open hearts, would be given a precious gift, discernment. They would not be deceived by false peace. They would not be broken by the coming storm. Even as the world unraveled around them, they would remain spiritually unshaken, not protected by wealth or status, but by grace. And so the question must be asked, are we already living in the days Padre Pio foresaw? Are the strange disruptions in nature, the spiritual confusion, the rise of digital illusions, and the erosion of truth simply coincidence? Or are they the beginning of a divine wake, a call to a world on the brink? Padre Pio's message was unwavering. Do not run. Do not despair. Strengthen your soul, because now that the signs are becoming visible, each of us must decide. Will we be swept away by illusion, or will we stand in the light of truth? Among Padre Pio's most haunting visions was one that revealed a future where humanity would be trapped, not by chains, but by illusion. A deception so convincing that even the faithful would be at risk. This deception, he said, would not be enforced by war or violence or tyranny, but by something far more seductive: technology. Padre Pio saw a world where people no longer sought truth through God, but through screens, where meaning was reduced to headlines, emotions were triggered by digital creations, and spiritual clarity was lost in a flood of noise. These illusions would be vivid, believable, emotionally stirring, but they would not be real. They would be crafted to manipulate, not to enlighten, carefully engineered to replace revelation with simulation. He foresaw a time when world leaders would use technology to fabricate signs and wonders, breathtaking displays in the sky, digital events that appeared divine, but had no connection to heaven. and people would believe them. They would see what looked like miracles and fall into a new belief system, one entirely disconnected from God. Social media, entertainment, even artificial miracles, all weaponized to sway the heart, dull the spirit, and redraw the boundaries of truth. And many would follow, because in this age of deception, Padre Pio warned, the line between real and false would become nearly impossible to distinguish, and only those anchored in faith would still recognize the voice of God. As Padre Pio looked further into the future, he saw that the spiritual deception would take on a form unlike any the world had ever known, a counterfeit spirituality, disconnected from God, built not on truth, but on sensation and spectacle. Through it, souls would be slowly led astray, not in defiance, but in quiet drift. And yet, amidst this great illusion, a faithful remnant would remain. These would be the souls who walked not by sight, but by belief. They would place their trust not in screens or signs, but in Scripture, in the sacraments, in the voice of God that speaks in stillness. These men and women would not be shaken by dazzling illusions or utopian promises. They would not be swayed by what the world called progress, because their roots would run deep, planted in faith, watered by prayer, and strengthened by grace. Padre Pio's message was clear and unwavering. Faith and prayer are the only shield against what is coming. He warned that the age of technological deception would test the very limits of human belief. And already we see glimpses of it. Artificial intelligence crafting faces and voices that never existed. Deepfakes blurring the line between fiction and reality. Virtual experiences replacing human connection. And curated feeds rewriting truth one pixel at a time. And if this is only the beginning, what will the next chapter look like? Padre Pio left a dire truth to guide us. Not everything your eyes perceive is real. Only what comes from God is truth. And only those deeply rooted in faith will be able to see clearly. The hour is late. The age of illusion is advancing. And the question remains, will you be among those deceived or among those who remain faithful to the truth? Before his death, those closest to Padre Pio revealed that he wrote one final message by hand. A sealed document, not meant for his time, but for ours. He instructed that it remain hidden until humanity reached the very edge of a great crisis. This was not a mere letter. It was a divine instruction, a spiritual last will and testament, written for the generation that would face the storm. According to those entrusted with its safekeeping, Padre Pio foresaw that this moment would come within our own lifetime. That everything he had seen, the visions, the signs, the deception, would unfold before our very eyes. It is said that this final revelation came during one of his most intense mystical experiences, one that left him weeping blood, shattered by what he had been shown. From that moment forward, he knew his mission was nearly complete, but he also knew that humanity's greatest trial had not yet begun. The sealed document is believed to contain not only warnings, but instructions, guidance on how to remain faithful, how to survive the spiritual storm, and how to preserve the soul through the coming darkness. These were not prophecies of fear. They were messages of preparation, and they were written for us. Why does this message matter? Because Padre Pio foresaw that before the document would be opened, humanity would begin to experience specific, undeniable signs. These would not be symbolic or vague. They would be clear, loud, global. They would mark the beginning of the final preparation. A great technological illusion, filling every screen, every home. False signs and wonders, designed to replace faith with fiction. A rising persecution of true believers, mocked, silenced, and labeled enemies of peace. And finally, the 3 days of darkness, A moment when the world would fall into a silence so deep, a darkness so complete, that only faith and prayer would preserve the soul. Now, as we enter the year 2025, whispers are growing behind closed doors. Some within the church are gathering, quietly discussing how to reveal this long, guarded message, and when. Because those who know what Padre Pio saw know that it was not legend, it was truth, and that truth may soon come to light. So the question now rises, why now? Why does it feel like the world is tilting? Some believe the alignment of events is simply too precise to ignore. Natural disasters are growing more intense and frequent. Faith is fading from public life. Society is more fractured, more polarized than ever before. And the acceleration of technology, especially its power to distort perception, has reached a turning point. All of it mirrors exactly what Padre Pio warned would come. Whatever the cause, one truth stands unshakably clear. The year 2025 may mark the unveiling of Padre Pio's final message. A message sealed with tears, entrusted only to those who would reveal it when the world was on the brink. But what will this message contain? Will it be a final warning, a last trumpet call before the veil is torn away? Or will it be a divine instruction, a sacred map for those who still seek to be saved? We cannot yet know the full contents, but we do know Padre Pio's final instruction. Those who live in the light of grace have nothing to fear. Those who remain in faith and constant prayer will be guided, protected, and sustained. Now, more than ever, those words burn with urgency. Watch and pray, for the time is near. Among the many visions Padre Pio received, he foresaw a great unraveling, a collapse that would begin not with explosions or headlines, but with whispers, small tremors, silent cracks in the foundation. He saw that the coming crisis would not strike all at once. It would creep in quietly, disguised as ordinary problems, until the tipping point arrived. At first, prices would rise. Slowly, subtly, basic goods would become harder to afford. Inflation would spiral. Currencies would lose value. And for millions, life would begin to feel unstable, as if something invisible was tightening its grip on society. And then, like a sudden gust of wind, collapse would come. Banks, even the most trusted, would begin to fail without warning. Financial institutions that had stood for generations would vanish overnight. Families would find themselves locked out of their life savings. Empty atoms, frozen accounts, long lines, and no answers. Governments would scramble to restore order, but every effort would fall short. And in the midst of this confusion, something new would quietly rise. A solution, a system, one presented as modern, efficient, secure. It would begin with the removal of physical money, framed as a practical response to economic instability. Cash would be phased out. Digital, only transactions introduced. At first, it would seem reasonable, even helpful. But Padre Pio saw something buried beneath its surface, something no one else could see. What emerged in Padre Pio's vision was not a solution, but a plan. He saw that the global collapse would be used as a turning point, an orchestrated transformation designed not merely for financial control, but for spiritual submission. The new system would eliminate physical currency altogether. Every transaction would be digitized, every purchase tracked, every movement recorded. Participation would not be optional. It would become the price of access to daily life. Many would praise this change. They would call it modern, efficient, safe. But those with spiritual discernment would see it for what it truly was, a mechanism of control, disguised as progress. A slow drift away from freedom. A carefully crafted system not just of economics, but of allegiance. Padre Pio foresaw a time when those who refused to participate would be cut off. They would no longer be able to buy or sell. Their bank accounts would be locked, their access denied, and they would be cast out of society, labeled not as dissidents, but as obstacles to peace. Religious communities that stood firm would be shut down. Churches that spoke the truth would lose their right to operate. Those who remained faithful would be branded as extremists, enemies of the new order. And yet, even then, Padre Pio saw hope. In the midst of growing tyranny, he witnessed the rise of a faithful remnant, a group of believers who would not bow, who would not compromise, who would not be moved. They would be mocked, labeled as rebels, cast aside, but they would walk with God. They would endure. They would shine like lanterns in a world overrun by shadow. So we must ask the question Padre Pio posed to his own generation. Is it already beginning? Inflation is rising. Banks are failing. Governments are rapidly moving toward a cashless society. The signs are not abstract. They are visible. They are here. The question is no longer if this will happen, but how soon it will reach full scale. And now is the moment to prepare, not with fear, but with faith. Because Padre Pio saw one final, radiant truth. Even in the darkest hours, God would not abandon his people. In one of his most uplifting visions, he saw a remnant being raised, not of the rich or the powerful, but of the faithful, chosen not for status, but for perseverance. These would be ordinary people, formed through hardship, refined by suffering. Their quiet trials, their daily prayers, their unseen sacrifices, all had been preparing them for something greater. They would become the lights in the coming storm. This remnant would come from every nation, from villages and cities, deserts and mountains, every culture, every language, men and women, young and old. But they would all share one defining trait. Their loyalty to God would not bend. They would stand firm as witnesses in the final days. And through them, God would reveal his glory in ways the world had never seen. Miracles would return. Hearts would be healed. The power of prayer would blaze brighter than ever before. And now, Padre Pio's final question becomes our own. Will you be counted among the faithful remnant? Or will you be swept away by fear, by comfort, by deception? The testing has already begun. The signs are all around us. And only those anchored in truth, wrapped in prayer, strengthened by grace, will be called forward for this extraordinary mission. So now ask yourself, when the moment comes, when the veil is lifted, and the world stands at the edge of truth and illusion, will you be among those still standing? Or will you falter beneath the weight of uncertainty? Because Padre Pio's vision didn't end in fear. It pointed toward empowerment. It foretold a spiritual awakening, not of institutions, but of hearts. He saw a day when the world would be gripped by chaos, confusion, and despair. But in that very moment, the faithful, those who refused to be moved, would rise. And they would be given extraordinary gifts, not talents, not strengths, but supernatural outpourings, signs that heaven had not forgotten the earth. Padre Pio described an anointing unlike anything ever seen before. The Holy Spirit would descend, not on the famous, not on the powerful, but on ordinary people. Mothers, fathers, elders, workers, children, people who had remained faithful in the quiet, people who had never been known by the world, but were fully known by God. And suddenly, they would carry divine power. They would lay hands on the sick and see them healed in moments. The blind would open their eyes. The paralyzed would rise. These would not be whispered rumors or wishful thinking. They would be real, visible, undeniable. Even skeptics would struggle to dismiss what their eyes could not explain. But healing was only the beginning. Some would be given divine sight, the ability to see not just the physical world, but the spiritual forces behind it. They would see angels guarding the faithful and sense the traps the enemy had laid, long before others could see them. Others would receive the gift of prophecy, voices carrying divine urgency, calling people back before it was too late. And most fearsome of all, Padre Pio saw that the authority to cast out evil would return in full force. No longer hidden in the shadows, the forces of darkness would be exposed and confronted. Padre Pio saw that every time one of God's chosen stood firm in faith and invoked the holy name of Jesus, darkness would retreat, demons would flee, homes would be freed, families, once broken by spiritual bondage, would be restored. This wouldn't be a secret revival tucked away in quiet corners of the world. It would be a global movement, igniting fires of faith in places once thought lost. But even in the midst of this outpouring of divine power, Padre Pio offered a sobering warning. These gifts would not be handed out lightly. They were not meant for show, for ego, or spectacle. They were reserved for those who had walked through fire, those who had been tested, refined, and remained faithful through pain, rejection, and silence. This would be heaven's army, not clad in armor, but in humility and holiness. And while many would witness the miracles and turn back to God, many others would not. Padre Pio saw that a large portion of the world would reject what was plainly before them. Miracles would be mocked, the faithful slandered. Some would be called frauds, others accused of emotional manipulation or exploiting false hope. Those who carried God's truth would be attacked, not because they were wrong, but because the world could no longer tolerate the presence of light. But the chosen would not fear. The Holy Spirit would fill them with supernatural courage, courage not just to endure, but to proclaim the truth without shame, even when threatened, even when hunted. Through their prayers, their voices, and their unwavering presence, hearts would begin to awaken. Souls would return home, and then the final signs would appear. In one of his most awe-inspiring visions, Padre Pio saw the heavens themselves declaring the hour. The skies would carry divine messages, brilliant lights crossing in impossible formations, radiant crosses appearing over places of deep prayer, and even the sun and moon shifting in color and brilliance. These signs would not be secret. Millions would see them, and the world would pause. Believers would fall to their knees, weeping in awe, knowing the time had come. But just as God revealed His glory, the enemy would strike back. Using technology and illusion, false signs would also rise. Artificial lights, manufactured wonders, projections into the sky, designed to confuse and deceive. And Padre Pio warned, only those with pure hearts and spiritual clarity would know the difference. They would not be fooled by dazzling images. They would not be shaken by clever illusions, because they would be guided by something stronger, truth rooted in God. This would be the final dividing line, the last call. And only those who had prepared, through prayer, repentance, and faith, would recognize what was truly unfolding. Begin early. That was Padre Pio's plea to parents. He warned that a child formed in truth, while still young, would be far better prepared to resist the deception of the world as they grew older. The seeds planted in innocence would grow into unshakable strength. And yet, he knew the time would come when raising a child in the faith would be seen as dangerous, even extreme. But to those who remained faithful, those who refused to let the world shape their children, Padre Pio promised divine strength, protection, and wisdom that went beyond human understanding. These were not just old-fashioned parenting principles. They were lifelines forged for a time like ours. He saw that families who accepted this calling would be the ones who rescued their children from the great deception. And in return, God would pour out discernment, heavenly guidance, and supernatural resilience upon every parent who stood firm. And today, as we look at the world around us, we see it happening. Moral confusion spreads like wildfire. Schools teach ideologies that contradict the gospel. Faith is mocked. Truth is reduced to emotion. But the door has not yet closed. There is still time to pray, to teach, to lead. The decision now rests with us. Will we allow the world to mold the next generation? Or will we rise as spiritual guardians in a time of testing? Padre Pio saw what few others dared to imagine. A moment coming when every soul on earth would be faced with a decision. Not a private struggle, but a global reckoning. A final, all-encompassing choice between truth and lies, light and darkness, God and the world. There would be no more room for lukewarm faith. No more hiding behind tradition. Every person would be tested. Many, even those who once claimed to follow Christ, would turn away when the cost of truth became too high. But those who endured, despite the mockery, rejection, and loss, would be prepared for the final mission. And they would carry a strength unlike anything the world had ever seen. Because God is not looking for the loudest, not the strongest, not the most influential. He is looking for the faithful, those who will believe when it costs everything, those who will endure when others walk away, those who will pray, fast, and weep for their families, their neighbors, their nations, those who will shine when the world goes dark. And now, the final question is not just where you stand. The question is, are you ready to be one of them? Because the last page of the story is about to be written, and heaven is watching.